And perhaps we're going to talk about this a bit later. Maybe I'm jumping here, but I'm not a specialist of Georgia at all. Most of my projects are Middle East, Africa, and now Central Europe. We just won a competition in Tirana, Albania, for the expansion of the city centre. But it's really my first steps in this part of the world. Although last year I was involved in Gorky Park, maybe which is the main park of Moscow and its regeneration strategy. But really, I'm a pretty. I don't really know much about this part of the world. So I'm really obviously my colleague Eugene knows very well about this, but also yourself. From Georgia, I think it would be good to have some kind of discussion. So all I can bring is my kind of experience in international projects. What's interesting is that most issues of cities are actually quite common between cities. All around the world, you have problems such as how to accommodate the growth of a city, how to solve circulation problems. How to protect the heritage of a city, how to develop, etc., etc. All these big issues are actually very common around the world. So maybe Eugene, you want to talk about specific post-Soviet period and leading the discussion. Maybe I shouldn't. Sorry.
Not at all. Yeah, indeed, it would be great.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. And as I word, I'm also not specialist in contemporary Georgian architecture and urban planning, but I start with my personal history. In the early 80s, I was involved in a very interesting project in Tbilisi. It was an international design seminar, Interdesign, in the 1980s. And I participated in this seminar, and we made the design for new urban development in Tbilisi. It was the location which is called Lochini. It's sorry, we already made the project, and we approved it. Mr. Shevardnadze, who was at that time the first secretary of Communist Party of Georgia, and it was an interesting project because it was very, in terms, very different from what in the Soviet republics was done at that time. It was very dense urban structure, similar to traditional Georgian Tbilisian houses with terraces, with balconies, with small courtyards, and we thought at that moment about humanization of traditional Soviet this industrial housing. Unfortunately, nothing happened of this project, but in very few years, in 5 years, started so-called perestroika, and suddenly all these ideals, all these positive thoughts about social development were completely turned off. It happened that suddenly all Soviet cities, and particularly capitals of republics, faced the very new situation. Instead of traditionally very strong planning urbanism, which has a good base of special institutes and architects and urban planners, and dedicated to social development of very special in Soviet kind of social development. Suddenly we faced the new situation with a very strong separation of poor and the rich, of wild capitalism, which invaded our cities, and we were not ready. No one, Russian or Soviet city was not ready for such invasion, and up to now we have the same problem which we faced first 20 years ago. And one important thing, which is for me maybe the matter of discussion today, is are we living in democratic societies and democratic cities, and what is civic society in our cities, and whom our cities belong to? Are we members of urban communities? Are we the owners of the city? And in this terms, the very important thing is who makes decisions regarding development of our cities. The problems of all our cities are more or less the same. It's, as I said already, a kind of gentrification or replacement of traditional environments and appearance of new gated communities of rich people who push out the traditional population of the centers of the city. What happens with traffic? Increasing of numbers of cars in 20 years, amazing. In Moscow, it's almost 300,000 cars per year, increasing of number of cars, and the city is already dying of traffic. The same I see happens, more or less the same happens in Tbilisi. What to do with historical heritage, and what to do with new projects which replacing the traditional historical environments, and who decides what to do. So as far as I know, in Tbilisi there are a lot of problems with more or less the same as in Moscow. And maybe I will say about Moscow problems a little bit later, but we continue with just an introduction, okay?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think quickly I want to actually open the discussion up straight away, but I do have one question which is perhaps to both of you, which is that the whole sort of concept of urban planning and cities, thinking about cities, it seems to be very international now. You know, you're talking about all these projects in sort of incredibly different countries and environments, and even if we're not talking about full-scale urban planning, we see a lot of foreign architects. You know, in this part of the world, we see Western architects coming in. Architecture has also become a very international discipline. And I'd be interested to hear both of your perspectives on sort of what are both the dangers and the potential advantages of I mean, you know, when you win a project somewhere like Lagos, how do you go about beginning to understand what the city's like? Do you have consultations with local thinkers on the issue? You know, how does it work, and what are the potential pitfalls of that?
Regarding Lagos, I mean, we were in charge of the it's called an urban structure plan, which is basically a vision for the city for the next 20 years. A massive project. It's the size of Paris, to give you an idea.